Welcome everyone to the webinar. It is a real pleasure to have you all present in this conversation. My name is Sandra Pellegrini. I am Senior Analyst for Latin America and the Caribbean for ACLED, or Armed Conflict Location and Event Data, a leading source of data and analysis on global conflict. Today, I'll be moderating our session where we will be discussing critical updates to ACLED's datasets and our recent report that is entitled Ecuador's Noboa declared war on 22 gangs. In his new turn, he faces many more. And this report comes as President Daniel Noboa begins his new 4-year term amid the spiraling crisis of gang violence, institutional fragility, and expanding illicit economies in the country. Ecuador used to be one of the safest countries in the region, but since 2023, it has maintained the highest homicide rate in Latin America. And it is in response to the deepening crisis that ACLED has decided to expand its coverage to include new detailed data on gang-related violence across the country. The expansions of ACLED dataset sheds new lights on these unprecedented security challenges, as figures shows that gang violence in Ecuador rose 60% in the first 5 months of 2025 compared to the same period last year. In our latest reports, our senior analyst for Latin America and the Caribbean, Tiziano Breda, examined this surge in gang violence, the root of this crisis, and also how past policies and decisions and current security efforts continue to impact Ecuador's criminal landscapes. To walk us through the expansions of our data, as well as the accompanying analysis, we are joined by Rose Davis and Tiziano Breda. Rose is a senior methodology officer on data literacy at ACLED. She previously worked as a researcher on the North America and Latin America desk and holds a Master of Global Affairs from the University of Toronto and a BA in Sociology and Hispanics and Latin American Studies from Brock University. Tiziano is also with us today, our senior analyst for Latin America and the Caribbean, and in his role, he contributes to the analysis of conflict demonstrations and political violence patterns in Latin America. Prior to joining ACLED, he spent over 7 years carrying out research on Latin American politics and security for the International Crisis Groups and IAI. Tiziano holds a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology from the University of Padua and a Master's degree in International Relations from the University of Bologna, Campus Forli, enriched by conflict resolution studies at the Johns Hopkins University and the Universidad Nacional de Colombia. Thank you for joining us, Tiziano and Rose. And we also have the pleasure and great honor of hosting Renato Rivera, who is a researcher, consultant, and professor specializing in the study of organized crime. He is currently a PhD candidate in rule of law and global governance at the University of Salamanca and has an outstanding track record leading research initiatives and projects focused on preventing organized crime in Latin America. As part of his professional work, he founded the excellent Ecuadorian Observatories of Organized Crime, establishing himself as a key authority in the analysis of criminal networks and the developments of evidence-based security policy. Thanks a lot for being with us, Renato. We're really grateful to have you with us. And before we get started, and as a general reminder, there will be ample time for questions and answers from everyone who's here connecting with us. And that will take place after the 3 panelists speaks. But do feel free in the meantime to pop your questions for them in the Q&A function throughout the events, either in Spanish or English. And with that, I will pass it over to Rose, who will start. She will start us off with a general overview of what the new data, the new gang violence data on Ecuador brings, followed by the remarks on the evolutions of the organized crime landscapes in Ecuador by Tiziano and then Renato. Rose, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone, and thanks again for joining us today. So I'll begin by introducing the project that frames today's discussion. So ACLED has recently launched systematic coverage of gang violence in Ecuador with data available from the 1st of January 2023 to present and now updated on a weekly basis. The expansion is prompted by a significant shift that we've seen in conflict dynamics in Ecuador since at least 2021. Ecuador has seen a sharp escalation in organized criminal violence that increasingly undermines public security, territorial integrity, and state authority. So ACLED does not typically include criminal violence in its data set. However, in contexts where organized criminal groups begin to challenge the state, by exerting, for example, territorial control, shaping politics and governance, and deploying public violence to assert power. ACLED does consider this violence to be political in nature in such cases, and these events are therefore included in the data set. So to determine whether such conditions are met, we apply a structured assessment based on 3 benchmarks and 7 respective indicators. Some of these include looking at the share of overall violence involving gangs. We look at the homicide trends, the state response to gang violence. Does it include militarized policing, for example? Is there evidence of de facto territorial control by gangs? And are there high-profile or symbolic acts of public violence, such as public displays of extreme violence, prison massacres, or assassinations of public officials? So we determined that Ecuador meets these criteria since at least 2021, and ACLED conducted a full assessment of gang violence in Ecuador, consulting with regional experts and testing a broad sample of criminal violence in the country that our researchers collected. And from there, we developed a methodology to identify events likely linked to gang activity in Ecuador. So this process ensures that we're capturing organized political forms of gang violence while excluding lower level criminal incidents like petty crime. So Ecuador now joins countries such as Mexico, Brazil, Haiti, amongst others, where ACLED does track gang violence as part of the broader conflict landscape. So with that, I'll now turn to present what the new data reveals, what you can expect to find in this new coverage. Next slide, please. So with the inclusion of this new gang violence in Ecuador's data set, ACLED has added over 7,250 new events covering the period from the 1st of January 2023 to the present, and new gang violence events are now integrated into our weekly data updates. Our researchers are currently working on coding further years of historical data for Ecuador, which will be published at a later date. So this has been made possible through the very hard work from multiple teams, including a group of dedicated researchers for Ecuador, the South America Research Desk, and our quality assurance team. So this expansion offers a new picture of the scale and nature of violence unfolding across the country. Of the newly added events, approximately 63% are categorized under ACLED's event type violence against civilians, which includes both direct attacks against civilians and abductions or forced disappearances. So these events could cover a wide range of tactics, including the targeted assassinations of politicians or civilians, which we often see carried out in drive-by shootings. It will also include extortion-related violent attacks on civilians, massacres involving 3 or more victims, and also events involving extreme violence, such as torture. Following this, slightly more than 16% of the new events are classified as battles, which is ACLED's event type that captures armed confrontations between rival gangs or between gangs and state forces. The data show that these are often occurring in urban neighborhoods, transit corridors, port areas, and within the prison system itself. So this breakdown reveals that Ecuador's patterns of gang violence more closely resemble that of Mexico, where there is a similarly high proportion of violent gang activity that's affecting civilians or targeting civilians. And Ecuador looks less like Brazil or Venezuela, where gang violence involves more frequent confrontations with state forces or between rival groups. Next slide, please. So we also analyzed this data using ACLED's conflict exposure metric, which measures the population living within 1, 2, or 5 kilometers of any violent gang-related event. And on this metric, Ecuador actually surpasses Mexico, meaning a higher percentage of the population in Ecuador is exposed to gang violence. In 2024, this was around 65% of Ecuador's population. And this is a stark reflection of the concentrated impact that this violence has on civilians in Ecuador. Next slide, please. So another emerging tactical pattern in the new data is the use of explosives by gangs, including car bombs and improvised explosive devices, often used as intimidation or retaliation. So this type of event where explosives are employed outside of any other engagement, such as within a clash, is actually more frequently seen in Ecuador's data than any other country where ACLED codes gang violence. So ACLED recorded over 300 explosives or remote violence events in Ecuador since 2023, which is 76% higher than Mexico for the same period of coverage. So next, I'll highlight another aspect of this project, which is the disaggregation of urban cities to the neighborhood level. Next slide, please. So as part of this project, ACLED's quality assurance team also retroactively disaggregated all events in Guayaquil and Quito to the neighborhood level, which allows for significantly enhanced granularity in analyzing urban conflict. So Guayaquil as a whole accounts for around 25% of all recorded gang violence events in Ecuador. And this refined coding to the neighborhood level reveals that the northern area of Guayaquil, so the areas south of Pascuales and north of Febres Correro, account for nearly 10% of all gang-related violence recorded nationwide. Other hotspots in Guayaquil include the northern area of Pascuales, which is home to several of Guayaquil's notorious prisons, and also Jimena in the south, which is a key port district, also heavily affected by gang activity. So this new data revealed that Guayaquil is indeed one of the most violent places for gang violence in Latin America, coming in third for a total number of violent gang events recorded in 2024, just after Rio de Janeiro and Salvador, but surpassing Culiacan and León in Mexico. So overall, this new data provides a detailed window into who is driving the violence, what tactics they use, how these patterns are evolving over time, and also what Ecuador looks like in the regional context, allowing for a much deeper analysis than what was previously possible. So with that, I'll pass it off to my colleague Tiziano, who will dive deeper into the data and the report on the context of gang violence in Ecuador.
Thanks a lot, Rose, for the excellent presentation, for guiding us through the rationale behind the inclusion of Ecuador and as a gang country, as we call these countries in which we cover organized crime violence as such. I would like to dive a bit deeper into the sort of the evolution of the gang dynamics that the country has been experiencing. And I can't do that without taking a step back to some dynamics that took place not in the past 5 years, but rather some 15 or even more years ago, which are deeply interconnected with what's going on right now. But also some evolution, part of the evolution of the gang dynamics that we see right now also is actually possible to infer it from the data that we collect. So gangs did not appear 5 years ago in Ecuador. Ecuador had another issue, let's say, with criminal gangs that took place between the 90s and early 2000s, where groups like Latin Kings and Los Nietas were responsible for much of the violence going on in the country, particularly in the main cities of Guayaquil and Quito. But this sort of seemed to have been sorted out in a way by a process that was launched by President Rafael Correa, a pacification process that essentially recognized these gangs as sort of youth organizations, integrated them into certain aspects of institutional work, educational work, and so on, in exchange for lowering the level of violence. And indeed, this had an impact on levels of violence. When Correa left office in 2017, Ecuador recorded one of the lowest homicide rates in Latin America, as Sandra already mentioned in her introduction. But critics argue that this process at the same time sort of permitted criminal gangs to gain political access and to build sort of powerful networks within institutions. And at the same time, this was coupled with or accompanied with a series of very flawed decisions by Correa and his successor, Lenin Moreno, when it comes to the handling of security and justice, because Correa shut down the US military base in Manta, which was tasked with monitoring the drug trafficking activities in the country. And Moreno even went so far as to dismantle the Justice Ministry, slash funding for the prison system at the time when prison population was increasing a lot, and also disbanding the anti-corruption secretariat. So on one hand, the institutions were getting weaker due to domestic political decisions. And on the other, Ecuador became an ever more appealing transit country, destination for the international drug trade. It had sort of been so for some years because it, of course, is strategically positioned between Colombia and Peru, the cocaine's largest producer countries. It offers very good infrastructures in terms of highways and particularly export-oriented ports. And it has the US dollar as an official currency, which facilitates money laundering. But two particular events destabilized sort of the equilibrium that had been upheld until the sort of mid-2010s. On one hand, the peace accord between the FARC and the Colombian government in Colombia from 2016 sort of removed one actor that was regulating, in a way, the southbound flow of cocaine to Ecuador, sort of liberalizing it. And at the same time, on the other hand, the competition between the main Mexican cartels of Sinaloa and the Jalisco New Generation cartel sort of was projected into the country, with the Jalisco New Generation cartel tried to establish alliances with the previously existing groups. So this, as I was saying, created tensions between these groups that previously sort of operated under the umbrella of Los Choneros in a sort of a confederation of gangs under the guidance of Lasquiña, sort of Los Choneros leaders. But these tensions eventually brought to his death in 2020, which was a turning point in the country's security deterioration, sparked internecine violence, first in jails in 2021 with a series of prison massacres, and then into the streets, with Los Lobos emerging as particularly the main actor challenging Los Choneros authorities, among others. So this converted Ecuador, this brought Ecuador to register the highest murder rates in Latin America since 2023, as Sandra was saying, sort of a dynamic that it still holds today. Next slide, please. Now, the relevance of the drug trade in the production of violence, the eruption of tensions between gangs, is evident when we look at the geography of violence in the country. 80% of gang violence that we've recorded since 2023 is concentrated along the coastal provinces, particularly, if you can see, in the coastal cities that hold ports, such as Manta, Esmeraldas, and particularly Guayaquil, that is, of course, the epicenter of violence in the country. But something that came up by looking at the new data that we collected, we noticed that sort of the diversification of the economic portfolio that gangs went through over the past few years, so spreading into extortion rackets, kidnappings for ransom, contraband of medicines, weapons, and other things, illegal gold mining in particular, which is a really key driver of violence at the moment, also drove gangs expansion throughout the country. So in the past 2 years and a half, we record some kind of gang activity, presence, or violence in over 2/3 of the country's municipalities or cantons, which is really, really stunning. And at the same time, it's important to look at subnational trends of violence, because in 2024, for reasons that we will discuss in the next slide, some provinces, particularly in the coastal area, particularly Guayas, for example, and Manabí, experienced a slight decrease in violent events, while others such as Azuay, Tungurahua, and Sucumbíos, so in the provinces that are in the Andes or in the Amazonian basin, experienced really strong increases in percentage terms of violence. And this is precisely has to do in part with this expansion and diversification of gang activities. Next slide, please. So in 2024, what happened? There was actually a shift in sort of the way in which the state responded to this escalation of gang violence over the past few years. Daniel Noboa, freshly elected in late 2023, in January 2024, declared the existence of an internal armed conflict, imposed states of emergency that basically have been implemented in the country almost perpetually ever since. First nationwide and then specific to some provinces. And basically tasked the military with either replacing completely or at least supporting civilian authorities in regaining control of the prison system and of gang-controlled neighborhoods in the major cities. So this was initially met with a lot of resistance by gangs. As you can see, January 2024 with the black line indicates the highest amount of clashes between security forces and armed gangs that we've recorded so far. But then these measures managed, at least initially, to make a dent and partly disrupt gang activities and lowering gang violence, at least for the first few months in which these were implemented. Of course, there were some shortcomings. First of all, this militarization of public security has been associated with an increase of security forces abuses, with increasing complaints about torture, sexual violence, particularly in jails, and even forced disappearances. That has been on the rise, unfortunately, over the past year or so, and it's all the more concerning because the government has repeatedly sort of come out to defend any potential abuses if they are committed for the greater good of security. And on the other hand, despite this initial sort of shock, if you want to call it that way, gangs sort of regrouped, and these measures possibly contributed to actually prompting even more violence. Why? Because the pressure that was increased, particularly in jails, when it's true, for the first year, the sort of mutinies and clashes within jails went down of about 2/3, so decreased by about 65-66% in terms of gang violence events. But at the same time, this hindered communication between imprisoned gang leaders and gang leaders in the neighborhoods. And at the same time, the increased pressure in the neighborhoods sort of forced some leaders to flee the country or to hide in more rural areas, also disrupting communication with those who remained in the sort of neighborhoods. This prompted not only disputes between gangs over the control of certain routes and neighborhoods, but also within gangs. So this prompted the gangs splintering into multiple factions and even former allies within the same group starting to fighting each other. So we recorded 37 active gangs in 2024, up from 24 the year before. And this sort of multiplication of disputes contributed, of course, to the eruption of multiple conflicts and the explosion of violence in early 2025, with, as Sandra was saying, a 60% increase in violence events in the first 5 months of 2025 compared to the prior to 2024 in the same period. Final slide. I would like to end up by saying that the report also explores the political dimension of gang violence in two ways, because of course, on one hand, these political decisions on how to approach security had an impact on, as we were just saying, on the evolution of gang violence in the country. But at the same time, gang violence has become a central issue, first of all, in the political discourse and including in electoral times. Noboa was elected in 2023, in part thanks to his promise to take on a hardline approach towards gangs, and possibly the measures that he took in the security realm explain partly why he was re-elected now in 2025 for a full term. But at the same time, violence has become a sort of a common feature of political competition in the country, or at least has invaded the institutional realm. Violence against political figure since 2022 has been on a constant rise. The local elections and the snap elections of 2023 recorded sort of the apex of violence in this regard. Of course, reaching the highest levels with the killing of a presidential candidate, Fernando Villavicencio. But since then, it seems to have become basically a chronic feature of the public institutional life of the country. We can see in 2025, the electoral period recorded more than 140 events of violence targeting political figures, which virtually turns it into the most violent electoral process. But if we go and look into the details of the events, we see much fewer events related directly with the electoral activities, sort of rallies, campaign activities, candidates being attacked, etc., and much more with the evolution of the gang dynamics, because the majority or a good portion of the political figures that were targeted during this period were rather municipal transit agencies, prison officials, including directors, prosecutors, judges. So we rather see a systematic attempt nowadays from organized crime groups to try and sort of co-opt local authorities, but also national authorities, and to weaken the rivals by targeting those who they perceive to be affiliated with the rival group. Of course, this process was not involving local elections, which often act as a catalyst of violence against political figures, particularly candidates and members of parties. So this will be a great challenge for another great challenge, I think, for Noboa, looking forward to make sure that the 2017 sectional or local elections do not experience higher levels of violence targeting political figures. I'll yield the floor to Renato for his comments, thanking him again for joining the webinar and reminding that there's a simultaneous interpretation for those who want to hear it in Spanish or in English.
Thank you very much to Tiziano, to Sandra, and Rose for the invitation. I'll switch my presentation to Spanish.
Thank you very much to all the participants. And in these brief 10 minutes, I'm going to focus my presentation on explaining exactly just how this increase in violence has happened in the last few years, and above all, this process of criminal fragmentation that Ecuador is experiencing in 2025. Next slide, please. If we take a look at the timeline of murders in Ecuador since 2020, we've seen a substantial increase. And perhaps this is yet one of the most surprising examples in Latin America because of this rapid increase in murders in Ecuador. As the previous presentations have mentioned, Ecuador has this direct relationship with the loss of power or the monopoly exercised by criminal organizations, Los Choneros in Ecuador. We have to take into account as well that Ecuador is an extremely relevant country for the worldwide economy in terms of organized crime. There are various illicit activities that have really gained strength in Ecuador, and the gangs have adapted to this profitability that Ecuador is experiencing given its illicit markets. The most representative data here is the illicit trafficking of drugs, of cocaine specifically, and also other crimes that show criminal interests such as illegal mining and extortion. What's the most surprising aspect of Ecuador? As we mentioned previously, it's not just this rapid evolution seen in the last 4 years, but also the prevalence of the use of firearms, which is even greater than the average for the whole of Latin America. What happened in 2024? Well, a surprising event, you could say, given the evolution of murder rates, is a reduction in 20% of the intentional murders. Part of this reduction could be attributed to the exercising of controls and above all this strict control on violence, and also due to different journalistic stories we've been able to gather, we've seen that this reduction and yet again this reduction we're seeing in 2025 has more of a relationship between organized groups, and also this relationship or this criminal violence Ecuador is experiencing. Some of the figures that ACLED mentioned earlier with the study of 52% of the events concentrated in Guayaquil, they precisely have this direct link with the use of firearms. 8 out of every 10 murders in Ecuador on average are committed using a firearm. This figure, as I mentioned, is greater than the Latin American average of 7% on average, and this also has to do with a lot of the territorial disputes being seen in Ecuador. I haven't included a slide on this because as an observatory we gather information every 6 months, so we haven't updated that yet for 2025, but up until April, the last quarter, we were able to analyze. There's an increase of 65% of intentional murders compared to the first quarter of 2024. You can see that there is an incident there which we could think about, which is the prevalence of intentional murders in the coastal provinces. Everything you can see in blue in the Ecuadorian map here on the left on the Pacific Ocean, and the connection that these intentional murders have with the criminal events or these gang violence events concentrated in Guayas, specifically in the city of Guayaquil. Guayas in the last few years has seen almost 50% of the murders on a national level. Guayaquil has an even higher rate concentrated of the murders, and this also has to do with the disputes between gangs. Next slide, please. Precisely, Guayaquil is the center for criminal violence. We've seen an increase in intentional murders. This has a direct impact on the rate of murders in Ecuador overall. And what the figures from 2024 have shown us is that there is a reduction of around 400 intentional murders in this city. This was the great question that we asked ourselves as an observatory. What has led to this reduction of 400 murders compared to 2023 if we base this on this variable of the state intervention not having changed radically over time? One of the attributions could be that the declaration of internal armed conflict has had an effect on the operations by armed forces, and this perhaps hasn't had a direct impact because this was already being implemented. And what we wanted to understand was precisely why this reduction occurred, and that's why we also tried to find other explanations based on this state variable, institutional variable. And if we look at the response by the state based on the judicial system, we can also see this pattern of impunity in the state response beyond the police and military intervention. What happens in Guayaquil is that you have a higher number of acquittals. It's an area where there is more laundering of assets, and on a national level there is monitoring, but there is a low number of punishments being handed out for organized crime. We could say that the criminal violence in Guayaquil has a lot to do with the territorial conflict, but also with a reduction of punishments in the system. Next slide, please. We're seeing a direct link between the crimes being committed. We've understood that the criminal fragmentation in Latin America, studied by ACLED as well, this has an effect on the increase in intentional murders in Latin America. And this is something that we're seeing since 2020. So we were able to divide this into two phases, and we found that the increase in violence in 2025 has a direct link to the second phase of this process of criminal fragmentation with a variable of insurgency. That's why we can see an increase in the use of explosives, where Ecuador is the country with the highest registration of the use of these explosive devices. And we've also seen these being used together with acts of terrorism, and gangs try to combat the state control authorities in this way. And this criminal fragmentation being seen in Ecuador was experienced in 2020, as Tiziano mentioned, with the murder of the head of Los Torneros led to a fragmentation of the gang into 5 or 6 groups: Los Tigrones, Los Lobos, Los Chonequeles are perhaps one of the most representative, some of the most representative groups, as well as other gangs. In the case of Chonequeles, they don't have a presence in other cities like other groups that do have, such as Lobos or Tiguerones, which are present in 2 or 3 provinces of Ecuador. And with this hegemony that we've seen of Los Choneros, these groups then confront one another to take control of certain territories. And unfortunately, we could say that this led to a phase of pacification, where in 2024, where Fito, the new head of Los Torneros, calls for peace between the gangs, above all in the prison system. And this led to a reduction in the number of violent acts in prisons and a reduction in violence, above all in the province of Las Esmeraldas and the province of Uruguayas. And this was in 2023. At the end of 2024, there was a new process of negotiations and of interrelations, of confrontations between different criminal groups in Ecuador, which led to a new process of criminal fragmentation. On the one hand, the arrest of Willie, the head of Tiguerones in Spain. This led to the fragmentation of Los Tiguerones into 2 new groups, Los Igualitos and Los Fénix. And that's why the data found by ACLED in their report precisely demonstrate that in certain neighborhoods, such as those mentioned in Guayaquil, are seeing new areas of violence because these are spaces where Tiguerones had reached certain hegemony, and this led to a reduction in violence. At the same time, we have the murder of one of the 2 brothers heading Los Chonequeles in Cali, and this led to another fragmentation of the Chonequeles into 5 groups. And then we also had the division of Los Lobos with the traditional faction and the other faction, and this demonstrates some of the violence that we're seeing in the province of Loros, which borders with Peru. What's the most serious part here for Ecuador is that at least 3 groups, such as Tiguerones, Chonequeles, and Águilas, we've found that these groups, their social positions, these are mostly children, adolescents in the coastal areas, and that's why we've seen this increase in children and adolescents being recruited by these gangs. And mostly by these three groups that are linked to this criminal fragmentation that Ecuador is going through. So this increase in violence in 2025 is linked to criminal fragmentation, where the institutional fragmentation does not seem to have representation in the reduction of the violence in Ecuador. Next slide, please. Just a brief conclusion. As an observatory, we're interested in understanding whether there are any substantial changes in the justice system to analyze whether the legal reforms which have been getting implemented in the last few years have a representative weight, or whether the evaluation of impunity also has an impact on violence. We're conducting various studies to understand the state's response through organized crime and through drug trafficking. In addition, this conclusion or this finding about the three groups which are recruiting mostly children and adolescents, this is also anchored in a study that we're going to be presenting next week on the forced recruitment of children and adolescents into gangs in Ecuador. This information will be available on our website. If you'd like, you can follow us on our social media channels. We have left our QR code there so you can find our documentation, our research, and you can widen your knowledge on the violent acts and the integration and interconnection between different groups and also different transnational organized crime that unfortunately Ecuador is forming part of. Thank you so much to everyone for your time, and I'll be available if you have any questions.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much to you, Renato, as well as Rose and Tiziano for those critical insights. All your interventions were significant in understanding, first of all, what is there in the new data that ACLED has published, but also what kind of analysis can be drawn from it, as well as how the organized crime landscapes in Ecuador has been shifting. Let's now turn to some questions that we have received for our speaker. Thank you very much to all of you who already shared their questions within the registration process, but also during the session. If you haven't yet, please feel free to drop your questions in English or Spanish into the Q&A. We'll do our best to answer those, although I'm saying we might be a bit short on time to address them all, but we'll make our best to cover them. Perhaps to get a head start on the questions, we received a couple of questions on the data per se. So that one will go to you, Rose. So I was wondering if you, also bearing in mind all the difficulties that exist in tracking the activities of organized crime groups, sometimes often because of the hidden nature of those very same activities. So could you perhaps tell us, well, first of all, what's ACLED's take on understanding what is an organized criminal group, but also highlight a couple of the challenges that comes with a project of collecting data on organized crimes. What were the limitations when trying to limit this kind of violence? And also, what, in your opinion, could be the potential improvements or innovations that could be brought in order to help capture the scopes and of the activities of criminal groups and their evolution? Thank you.
Thanks. That's a great questions. So in terms of the difference between organized criminal groups and gangs, the short answer is that we do include both in our data set, since both are forms of organized criminal activity that are linked to kind of the broader conflict landscape. So in the data set, you can filter using the interaction term political militia, which will give you the results for all events related to both to including cartels, broader criminal, organized criminal organizations involved in international drug trafficking, for example, and also local gangs are categorized under that same term. So you can filter then further by the individual actor name from there. So I guess while there are differences in the operations between broad organized criminal groups and gangs in terms of tactics and activity, they both do represent different aspects of the broader political violence that we intend to capture in the data set, as local gangs are often acting as allies or affiliates to larger criminal organizations and their activity. So what we focus most on is trying to differentiate between this type of organized violence by both transnational cartels or criminal organizations and also these local gangs. And we're differentiating this between what we would consider to be petty crimes or more petty crimes like theft, and also to exclude interpersonal violence from the data set. And for the other part of the question in terms of data collection, so one of the biggest challenges is that many events aren't clearly attributed to specific groups in the source material. So a lot of violence, especially extortion-related violence, targeted killings, and other types of violence like that is carried out by unidentified actors, and the sources often don't name the specific groups involved. So this means that we can't code the name group unless it's explicitly reported. So we would code an unidentified gang, for example, or an armed group. To work around this, we can use contextual information like where groups are known to operate, make some inferences there, or to kind of help interpret patterns even when attribution isn't possible to a specific gang. So another challenge would be the fragmentation and shifting alliances between groups. These can be hard to track in real time, as they're not often reported, but we do capture some of this through strategic development events, which are non-violent events that ACLED researchers code to track important political developments related to any conflict. So in this context, we capture arrests of gang leaders or important changes to a group, such as large weapons seizures or drug seizures. So still, due to underreporting, this is a challenge for us, but it can be helpful for context on actor activity and the broader trends. And I think the last part of the question, so looking ahead, there are a few ways we can integrate other data sets or improve our data sets, including integrating more non-traditional sources like data from local observatories, even social media, for example, to get a fuller picture, especially in underreported and rural areas. And I think finally, building stronger partnerships with local organizations can also help validate what we're seeing in the data that we collect and fill in these gaps in actor attribution, for example, for additional context to complement this very large data set that we've now collected. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Rose. That's very also insightful about how we understand the organized crimes and how we track their activity within our data set. Some of the questions we have received were rather focused on the impact of the escalations of violence in Ecuador, the impact that it had on civilians more specifically. We received, for instance, questions on what has been the impact of such violence on forced displacements. And also, as part of Rose's presentation, what we have seen is that Ecuador's violence has grown increasingly lethal for civilians, not only as civilians being directly deliberately targeted, but also in the realm of other activities such as extortions, kidnapping, forced recruitment, and high-profile attacks. So perhaps for you, Tiziano, could you tell us a bit more how this shift of violence has affected different sectors of Ecuador societies, and what are the main patterns in conflict zones that we're seeing in terms of affectations for civilian? Thanks a lot.
Thanks to you, and thanks for asking the question. Indeed, there are multiple ways in which a growing number of civilians is being affected by this fragmentation of criminal disputes and the expansion of gangs' presence throughout the country. First of all, as Rose mentioned at the beginning, there's a growing number of civilians that are exposed to violence at large. So an explosion, as an act of intimidation towards the local authority, or as an extortion threat, but also clashes between gangs, clashes between them and state forces. Sort of any kind of gang violence is more and more frequent, and this turns Ecuador into, according to the tool that Rose was showing, which is a conflict exposure metrics, turns Ecuador into basically the country in which the highest percentage of the population is exposed or was exposed to gang violence in 2024 in Latin America, with around 65% of the population exposed. Then there's an affectation that is more common in other countries, but it's relatively new to Ecuador, which is what it's hard to track for us, particularly when it comes as a drop by drop or individual or small groups of people. But internal displacement is certainly a dimension that is starting to show up as a consequence of growing gang violence. The Norwegian Refugee Council came out with a few weeks ago with a publication estimating that around 100,000 people were forced to leave their houses in Ecuador in 2024, which would put Ecuador as the third country in Latin America and the Caribbean for the amount of people that were forcibly displaced, just behind Colombia, which is, of course, an historical issue, unfortunately, with internal displacement and confinements, and Haiti, which is also experiencing certainly a dire security crisis. But as we're mentioning, Sandra, civilians are also targeted directly, not only exposed to violence. And I think this happens in at least three dimensions. First of all, they are targeted as part of gang disputes. So gangs attack, or organized criminal groups attacked or try to weaken the rivals by targeting directly what they suspect as to be collaborators or relatives. In some cases, probably active gang members of a rival gang if they have information. Unfortunately, it's not always possible for us to determine whether the person that was killed belonged to a gang or not. But certainly the amount of civilians that in many cases are killed in multiple killings, in massacres, is an indicator of them being targeted as a way to sort of make incursion in a territory controlled by a rival gang. Also, in some cases, it's a way to demonstrate that if a rival gang is already present in a certain territory, it's a way to show that they don't have the ability to actually provide security for the dwellers, the inhabitants of that particular community or neighborhood. And therefore, it's to try and cut the ties, not to sever the ties, as also Renato was mentioning, between the local population and the gang operating in a certain area. Secondly, civilians are used as sort of cash cows increasingly, right? So with the increase in extortion-related attacks, kidnappings for ransom, which is also a practice that has increased dramatically over recent years, with usually businessmen being targeted, but not only, and ransom of up to $1 million being asked. But even violent thefts of trucks that turns deadly are even more common features of armed criminal groups' civilian targeting. When it comes to extortion, some of the categories that are unfortunately more common, as in other contexts, barbershops, restaurants, owners or employees, mechanics, taxi drivers, and so on. But some categories are quite peculiar to Ecuador in our database, which are the fishermen. That are certainly not something that always appears as a targeted sector of the population, and port workers that are targeted for either extortion or at least cooptation attempts to make sure that illicit goods make their way into port facilities. Finally, I think there's an institutional dimension of violence or targets that become basically political in three aspects. The gangs target sort of political figures or officials to ensure the flow of illicit goods and the control over illicit economies in prisons and in the streets. That's why we see a lot of transit agents being targeted, a lot of prison officials, which also sort of gives me the idea that sort of there's a shift in prisons that gangs are trying to sort of reverse in terms of attacking directly the head of prisons that were put in place last year. Secondly, the attacks that are meant to seek impunity for the crime, so attacks against off-duty security officers, judges, prosecutors that are also on the rise. And finally, attempts to co-opt local authorities that we were saying. So in this case, mayors, councillors, municipal workers are the most common victims. And I guess that as gangs continue to sort of fiercely fight for territorial control, expand their presence, diversify their economies, unfortunately, civilians are likely to be increasingly at risk in the coming months.
Well, thank you very much, Tiziano, for the overview of these gloomy prospects. I also know that you worked on the topic, Renato, especially on the thematic of forced recruitment. So if you want to add a couple of words on that, that's fine. But the questions that I also want to address to you is the role, well, what kind of measures can be undertaken both from international actors and domestic actors in Ecuador to help improve or curb the rising insecurity in the countries. So we had, for instance, questions arising on the role the US has played on the security landscapes in Ecuador, especially on the removal of the US military base in Manta, and whether that contributed to the worsening of the situations. So could you tell us a little bit more first about the impact of the US intervention on security Ecuador in the past, but also looking ahead, what the role US policymakers can play in supporting security efforts and also safeguarding of human rights. But also interesting in hearing your perspective on what can the national governments do and what could be the most effective tools or approach they could use to take stronger actions against criminal groups, with the specific questions looking at how the use of ley de extinción de dominio, I guess, a set forfeiture laws in English. Thank you very much. And I know you have little time, but the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I'll try to do as short as possible.
The impact of the US, above all, if we're talking about the military base, in terms at least of the data that we have, in terms of the cocaine captured, the exit of this military base didn't have any effect on the capture of cocaine. The increase of cocaine capture actually happened from 2010 and further ahead up until today. So the military base as a variable for control doesn't have an effect on the cocaine being detained. The cocaine, this happened because of the direction of the drug trafficking, because of the police that has been doing this with great support from the US, and also because of the increase in not only the production, but also the consumption of cocaine. And so these two aspects of supply and demand have meant that we've seen this increase in Ecuador, in Panama, in other European ports too. This has a link to the demand, as I mentioned. In fact, part of the debate on the Manta military base, whether this has an effect on the number of intentional murders, this also doesn't have a direct link. A military base, its mission isn't to reduce intentional murders. In fact, La Manta, up until 2019, it was based to giving information to the different authorities to embarkations in the Pacific Ocean. In this sense, there wasn't an increase in the number of intentional murders. In fact, the number of intentional murders reduced after the exit of the military base. And this was also due to the strengthening of the control authorities. If we also think about the situation in 9/11, improving the video surveillance and the weakening then of the institutions which took place at that time, the US and other cooperators with Ecuador had other opportunities. And this also has a lot to do with the strengthening of the research skills and the generation of mechanisms offering joint work of exchanging information between different research units working on criminal organizations. If we think about drug trafficking as a cross-border criminal phenomena, as well as this registration of firearms that we mentioned, the second possible nexus that you have as well with tax havens, as well as possible links, equatorial links with cross-border groups from other countries. This is essential information that attorneys require and the different police research units require, police inquiry units require, and obviously the US can collaborate with this, as can other European authorities. This is a debate that we've seen a lot in the last 5 years on this law, asset recovery law, which has been modified 3 times from 2021 to 2025. We've seen various processes ongoing. Unfortunately, there's no administrative process which has led to any firm decision on the asset recovery law. This has led to all of the authorities involved needing to understand how the asset recovery law works. And I know that the US has been supporting this. The European Union in the last 2 years has also been trying to support institutions to improve the state's response, above all, due to the economic impact of these criminal organizations' activities. The best way to tackle these gangs is to tackle their assets, and that's where institutions need to strengthen their skills in terms of controlling that.
Well, thank you very much, Renato, for those insights. Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have today. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to Rose and Tiziano also for this really critical report. We're also pending Renato's latest reports. I highly encourage you, well, to read all of the inputs that if you haven't already, you can do so via the link in the chat. We just shared the latest reports. We truly hope that you found this discussion fruitful, and we look forward to seeing you again in a future webinar. And thanks again to all of our speakers today.